We got introduced to David last time, and I finished with chapter 18 in the first book of Samuel. And this is where we find David getting married or being given the daughter of King Saul as wife. He earned that with 200 foreskins, if you recall that. So after this story, after this event, this incident, King Saul very much spirals out of control. So he's no longer manic depressive. He is creating a concerted effort among his loyalists to get rid of David, to kill him. Chapters 19 and 20 in the first book of Samuel are very pivotal in the story. And from here on, it becomes increasingly intense, right? So I would like to pause at these two chapters for a little bit and discuss David and discuss the importance of these chapters and why they are pivotal and why they are critical to the storyline among other events that have happened throughout the world and continue to be happening today, right? So, first of all, after chapter 18 is where David essentially becomes what is considered to be a statistical anomaly, right? He's a statistical anomaly. So he was a shepherd, which is very common, right? He was a shepherd, which is very common. He married the daughter of a king, which is also not that unusual. He later on became a king, which is also not that unusual because there are a whole lot of kings, right? And then he also wrote poetry, which in and of itself is also not that unusual. He played a musical instrument that is also in and of itself not unusual. He organized a war machine and he created a military orchestra, which you could say is something that is unique, but also it's not that unusual. On top of that, he built cities and he built a kingdom, right? And not to mention that he was exceptionally good looking, right? He was, as I explained last time, he was comely, which describes unforced grace and unforced mercy that was visible in his outward appearance, right? So he was exceptionally good looking. In combination, all these attributes make him a statistical near impossibility, right? This is a very, very difficult to statistically believe that a person like that actually existed, right? Which is why many people, for the longest time, historians in the world, just simply did not agree that this person, David, existed until there was archaeological evidence, overwhelming archaeological evidence located, and it was referring to the dynasty of the house of David. It wasn't specifically talking about David. It was referring to the dynasty of the house of David. So in that sense, secular historians, those who do not take the Bible for what it says, right? They don't take it for its word. No puns intended there. They do not accept evidence in the Bible as proof of existence. So therefore, they need to find secular evidence, such as archaeological findings, and that's how they finally came to terms with the idea that David actually did live, and he did live about 3,000 years ago, or about 1,000 years before Christ, right? So I will talk about his name, because his name is extremely rare. I know that may not sound the case today, although I will prove to you that it is still the case today. So the name David is unique in the Bible. It refers to only one person, and that is King David, the one who was a shepherd. And it is also extremely unique in the ancient Near East. So in the area where David lived, that name is essentially a ghost. It just doesn't exist. So if we take, for example, other names in the Bible that repeat many times, for example, Yeshua, the one that we have Jesus from, and Joshua also, right? The name Yeshua, that's the name that we today call Jesus or Joshua. Those names are derived from Yeshua. That is a relatively common name. We have at least 4 individuals, including Christ himself, who are named Yeshua. We also have various other names that are constantly repeated. They're reused. So in that sense, the name David is extremely unique. Also, none of the surrounding kingdoms ever used that name as for one of their kings. So none of their kings were named David. For example, Saul is a name, King Saul is a name that has been used by other cultures surrounding the culture that I'm talking about. Same thing with Solomon, his son's name. Solomon's name is also used in various other royalties and their offspring throughout the generations in the ancient Near East. But the name David is simply missing, right? It's M-I-A. It's also missing today, and that is something that I wanted to talk about. So if you take the name David as used by a ton of people on earth, right? It's used in Western European culture, right? It's used in Eastern European countries as well. It's a relatively well-known name. It's obviously used in countries who speak languages that are derived from Latin. So everything in South America, everyone in South America, that name is very common. The name is suspiciously missing from two upper echelons of society. Suspiciously missing generationally. And the first echelon of society where that name is missing, it is as common as the plague, let's put it that way, is royalty. So, European royalty today, or at any given time in the past however many thousand years there has been European royalty, simply does not use the name David for their children. So therefore, you can try naming one King David, right? There's 1,300 years of British monarchy. It's the longest surviving independent monarchy. There's not a single King David, right? There are a lot of kings that have names that are very common among the people, like Charles, you take William, right? You take James. All these names are repeated, Henry, over and over and over for British kings and their children, but not a single King David, right? Very interesting. Also, no royalty outside of Europe on earth has used that name. So essentially, that name is missing from royal records. It just doesn't exist, even though it's an extremely popular name among common folks, right? Like you and I. The other echelon of society where the name David is completely MIA is European clergy, so religious institutions. For example, have you ever heard of a Pope David, right? There are no Popes David. Out of hundreds of archbishops in the Anglican Church, hundreds of them, there's not a single named David, archbishop. Now, unlike a pope, archbishop doesn't choose his name. I mean, you can kind of see why a pope would be a little bit getting too closer to the sun choosing a name like David, right? But archbishops are simply named for who their names are as signed on their birth certificates, right? We don't have a single one of them, right? So statistically, that is extremely strange. The thing about this is why this is so crazy is that the royalty and the clergy, right? And also as far as the clergy is concerned, Eastern European patriarchs, you don't have any that are called David either, right? The bearded guys out there in Eastern Europe, the Orthodox churches, not a single one renames himself to David, right? And it's got nothing to do with the fact that he's a Judean king. I mean, John and Paul and all these guys, they were also Jews, right? So it's not like you're singling the name for whatever ethnic reasons. It just doesn't make any sense, right? So what is kind of interesting is that those are the people, when you take royalty and you take religious institutions along with political figures, those are the names that get recorded in history, right? Those are the names that get recorded in history. 300 years from now, no one is going to read about you and I, but they are going to be reading about who was king, who was archbishop, who was pope, and who were the political figures around that time and what exactly happened then, right? They're going to read about us. But what they're not going to find is a whole lot of Davids, right? Even though, as a general population, that is an extremely common name. I can name off the bat, I can probably name 5 Davids that I know, if not 10, right? So in that sense, this name has been a ghost throughout history, right? Throughout the last 3,000 years, this name just simply doesn't exist to the extent that we would expect it to exist in history books and in various religious recordings throughout the generations. And remember, those people are the ones that kept record of history because they were literate. They could read and they could write, and therefore they kept history, yet that name is completely missing, right? So we could just simply say that this is a statistical anomaly, and we could probably find another name like David that is extremely common, but is missing from history altogether, right? And what is recorded as history. Or there could be a little bit of bad juju with that name up there in those higher echelons of society, right? Maybe this is a case of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because guess what God told David? And he repeated that, and that is repeated twice. The first time it's in the second book of Samuel, and the second time is in the first book of Chronicles, and that's what I'm going to read to you now, and that's something that God told David, right? And he told him. So this is through Nathan the prophet. So Nathan is the one speaking to David and conveying the words of God. Now therefore thus shalt thou say unto my servant David. So this is God talking to Nathan. Now therefore thus shalt thou say unto my servant David, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I took thee from the sheepcote, even from the following the sheep, that thou shouldest be ruler over my people Israel, and I have been with thee whithersoever thou hast walked, and have cut off all thine enemies from before thee, and have made thee a name like the name of the great men that are in the earth. Okay? So, this is God's unambiguous promise to David that there's just not going to be anybody like him. Okay? That's his promise. And God has kept that promise for 3,000 years, one way or another, right? One way or another. Either these people that don't name their royals and don't name their religious figures, David, they either know this and they kind of tend to stay away from that name and don't want to roll the dice too much, or it simply is the way that it is, right? And it is a prophecy that is being fulfilled to this day and has been fulfilled for 3,000 years since he was given that promise by God, right? We also have other attributes of David that make him exceptional, right? I mean, in addition to writing poetry, his mind is also extremely analytical. So it's both analytical and creative. I mean, he establishes a war machine with branches of the military that we use in Western society to this day. And this was 3,000 years ago, right? His organizational skills are exceptional. So on top of an extraordinarily creative mind that can write acrostic poems, right? He also exhibits highly analytical skills. He's extremely detailed. He's extremely strategic. Now, he's a very impulsive man, as we'll see that over and over again. But he's not erratic at all, right? He is 100% strategic. Now, the one thing that is a common thread, if you will, and that links these disparate personalities, right? I mean, he just literally is a different person combined into one individual, right? These different personas, there's one thing that is woven and it ties them together, and that is his language, okay? So that is his language. And it is not just his poetry that is exceptional, and it is very unique in the sense that it has a unique style that is immediately identifiable. It's also his dialogue, okay? When he talks, to people, and we're going to read that. We're going to read that in chapter 20. This is the longest recorded dialogue of David with other people. When he talks to people, to his friends, as we're going to read, you see the exact same style as his poetry, right? The syntax, that is the structure of the sentences, how he positioned words is extremely unique just to him, okay? This presents a massive problem for secular historians, okay? In order for you to have such unique style, in order for you to write such complex poetry using extremely complicated language with winding clauses, you need to have an incredible command of language, okay? An incredible command of language. And why would that be a problem, right? Why would that be a problem? I mean, if David is well-spoken, he therefore is something else as well, right? We call these people also, we call them well-read, right? We use that interchangeably. When someone speaks well, more than likely he's extremely well-read, and he probably writes really well, just like David does. He talks well, he writes well, but that is a problem because he lived 3,000 years ago. And guess what? Secular historians are telling us that that culture 3,000 years ago did not have an alphabet, okay? It did not have an alphabet, which how can you write acrostic poems? Acrostic means every verse starts with a letter of the alphabet. So in this case, Psalm 25 is an acrostic poem. Verse 1 starts with the letter A in their language, then B, then C, then D, then E and F, and so on in their language, okay? So secular historians, they refuse to admit that this was written by David during the time of David because no alphabet existed. It takes hundreds of years. Linguists know that. Once an alphabet exists and it was barely getting developed at that time, then it takes hundreds of years for someone to keep reading and getting example of refined language for you to be able to construct that type of poetry, right? So what secular historians, those of the world that don't take the Bible for its word, they claim that David actually didn't write this after they admitted that he lived 3,000 years ago. And in fact, what they are saying is that someone else wrote this 300 years later, either by somehow word of mouth, getting these poems that somehow had alphabetic verses and acrostic style, right? And then 300 years later, they composed all this stuff and then they attributed these writings to someone, David, that lived 300 years prior to them, right? Which is absolutely absurd, right? I mean, how many of you are going to sit down on a, say, Friday night, and 300 years later, these people were in massive wars and famines and exiles and slavery again in Babylon, right? So someone is going to sit down and write hundreds of pages of poetry and dialogue and then attribute it to someone else who lived 300 years before. Or somehow they falsified, they corrected the prose decades later, and therefore it comes through in such refined shape, right? It is complete and utter nonsense. I mean, first of all, this book, just like a lot of other ancient books, it's not the only ancient book, it invokes curses, multiple curses on people who touch this text, right? This text is not to be touched. It's not to be edited, okay? It's not to be refined. It's not to be polished. It is the way that it is. Now, I'm not talking about translating it here. I'm talking about just modifying the meaning of what, in this case, David said and wrote, right? So this is one of those battles that you just simply do not hear about, unlike, for example, which bathroom you can use, right? This is a battle that you don't hear about, but is a critical battle to world history because it discusses the creation of the alphabet. So everyone knows, every historian knows that the Latin alphabet, the one that we use for English, came from the Greek alphabet. Everyone knows that the Cyrillic alphabet also came from the Greek alphabet. And everyone knows that the Greek alphabet is derived from what? From the Hebrew alphabet. That's the original language that this text is written in, the Old Testament, right? So if secular historians, and if they were to admit that David wrote this poetry 3,000 years ago, they are in a world of hurt, okay? They are backed up against the ropes, and someone is throwing punches left and right. Now, let me tell you why it's a huge problem if they date the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, hundreds of years prior to what they currently have it as, right? Then this right here, this book, it becomes all of a sudden the history of language, right? The history of written language. Because if you were to take this book for its word, then of course David had an alphabet, right? Of course David had writings for what? Close to 400 years, right? The timeline of this book tells us that Moses lived roughly 400 years prior to David, and that he received what from God in writing on 2 tablets. They're called 2 tablets. God gave him 2 tablets of what? Right? Gave Moses 2 tablets of written words, right? Numerous written words. And not just once, he gave him twice another set of tablets because Moses threw them because he was upset and they broke. So God gave him another set of those 2 tablets that has massive amounts of writing that entails alphabet and written language for a long time before David, and definitely for a much longer time than what secular historians are telling us that the alphabet was created, right? So this is a huge problem in history. And the thing is that recently there's archaeological evidence coming in hot and heavy that actually even the surrounding cultures had some form of written language long before people think. So down the road, they will come around, those historians and those anthropologists, they will come around and admit that ultimately David could have actually written this himself, and the book of Samuel was actually written during the time of David by his contemporary. In this case, this is Samuel, right? Until historians admit that that's a fact, then we're going to be stuck with the explanation that somehow someone, hundreds of years later, wrote in the name of David and then wrote amazing poetry for no benefit whatsoever because, he couldn't just exactly sell books for fun back then, right? So you're dipping your pen in ink and just writing away because why not, right? That's our logical explanation. And in fact, one of the most famous linguists of our time, he's so famous that he was in the Jeffrey Epstein emails. That's how famous he is, okay? You have made it if you are in his emails or on the flight logs, right, of his express airplane to the Virgin Islands. Oh, man. So that's how famous this linguist is. He's now in his 1990s. He barely talks about written language, but his idea is that unlike spoken language, which is essentially mandatory for human communication, written language is apparently not. That's what his stance is. This is the most famous linguist of our time. No wonder he's in the Jeffrey Epstein emails. I mean, this makes absolutely no sense. He's saying that written language is only for record keeping, and that's why it was started, for accountants and people who wanted to keep record of historical events, which is absolute trash thinking. This is insane. I mean, he's in his 1990s, so he's deep into the dementia category here. However, he's been saying that for decades, right? And it's complete nonsense. Just like I said earlier, if someone is well spoken, more than likely he is well read. Hello, it's obvious. I mean, written language, you cannot talk this kind of poetry word of mouth. We don't talk in poetic phrases whenever we talk to people. Written language is completely different. It's used for completely different purposes than oral and spoken language. That's why we have children, right, starting to learn the alphabet and to read early on, because it's an efficient way of educating someone. It's an extraordinarily efficient way of communicating with people. I mean, the alphabet and the creation of the alphabet is a massive historical event, right? Digital code is 100% based on the alphabet, right? I mean, outside of the zeros and ones in the base layer, every single digital code layer afterwards is dependent 100% on the alphabet, right? So it's complete insanity for a linguist, for a renowned linguist, to make that kind of statement. And this is the stance he has taken, right? So complete and utter nonsense. But either way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 19, and then I will show you why this is pivotal. It's pivotal in both the story, because the story from here on becomes increasingly intense, right? I mean, there's slaughter of innocent people, murder of children, right? There's rapes, there's adultery, more murder, more mayhem, all kinds of other brutal, right, incest, brutal developments after these few chapters. What this chapter 19 does is it's almost as if it intentionally slows you down through its syntax. So the syntax becomes incredibly more complex. And when we get to hear David talking to his friend Jonathan later on in chapter 20, what you're going to find out is that his syntax, his sentence structure is incredibly complex. So as you're reading and you go through Goliath and you go through the story of the foreskins and you go through the David marrying Michal, and then you get to chapter 19, and then you simply stumble upon your own thoughts because it's very difficult to read, right? So that type of almost intentional writing slows you down and makes you start to think about what is being said. Moreover, this is conversation between people. So we should be able to understand what in the world they're telling each other, right? It's not some sort of complex theology here that we're talking about. This is just simply a dialogue, political intrigue, right? And later on, a love story between David and Abigail, between people. So we should know exactly what they're saying, yet the text makes it very difficult and slows you down, and it almost telling you, stop and read, because things are changing fast over here. You need to slow down, right? So this is incredible command of language. Let me just put it this way. If a contemporary writer possesses the type of skill, the type of skill that slows you down just with his own language and points out specific aspects of the story, right, then they would be an instant millionaire. This is a skill that is not found on earth. That's how amazing this is, right? So this is in the first book of Samuel, and this is chapter 19. And again, this is after the story of the foreskins, and David and Michal are a couple now. So David is the son-in-law, right, of King Saul, and he's also the brother-in-law of Jonathan. So Jonathan and Michal are brother and sister. Their father is King Saul. David marries Michal. So therefore, David and Jonathan are not just friends now, they are brother-in-law, right? And Saul spake to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David, and Jonathan told David, saying, Saul my father seeketh to kill thee. Now therefore I pray thee, take heed to thyself until the morning, and abide in a secret place, and hide thyself, and I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where thou art, and I will commune with my father of thee. And what I see, that I will tell thee. And Jonathan spake good of David unto Saul his father, and said unto him, Let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he had not sinned against thee, and because his works have been to thee word very good. For he did put his life in his hand, and slew the Philistine, and the Lord wrought a great salvation for all Israel. Thou sawest it, and didst rejoice. Wherefore then wilt thou sin against innocent blood to slay David without a cause? And Saul hearkened unto the voice of Jonathan, and Saul sware, As the Lord liveth, he shall not be slain. And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan showed him all those things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in times past. Right, so this is beautiful, beautiful elevated language with a dramatic shift in syntax, right? So the structure of these sentences becomes very complex to the point where, honestly, this is pushing me towards my ability to read English, because this is grammatically very correct English, without sounding like a fifth grader, right? And kind of like in school, whenever you're reading something and you're stumbling over what you just read, and the teacher asks you, explain to me, what did you just read, right? To see if you actually understood what you read, and you have no idea what you read, right? Because you were thinking too hard on how to read something and how to arrange those words in an order that makes sense to you, so you didn't even understand what you just read. And this is precisely what's happening here. And it just gets worse, right? It escalates further. So what happens here is King Saul makes it very clear to Jonathan and his servants, so everybody, right, that they should kill David. Jonathan tells David, hide right over here in this field. I'll go talk to my father. I'll put in a good word for you, and then we should be good. I'll come and tell you, right? And that's precisely what happens. Once again, here we have to piece the story all together. We don't know if King Saul is at any point in one of those fits of rage that he's been getting into, right? Remember, he threw javelins at David, trying to just literally nail him to the wall a couple of times at this point, right? So we don't know if that's the case. We don't know how much Jonathan knows about his father trying to kill David, right? Up until the next paragraph, we don't know exactly how much Jonathan knows. So there are a lot of unknowns, but what we do know is that at this point, King Saul relents and says, okay, I'm not going to kill him. You're right. Why would I be sinning against someone who's benefited me tremendously, right? That's what King Saul is thinking. Once again, this is court-refined language. Now, remember, Jonathan is next in line after King Saul. So this is not just political intriguing here, right? I mean, the stakes are huge. First of all, he's stepping in for David, who is his friend, right? He delighted much in David. So they were really good friends. He doesn't want to see his friend get killed, right? Also, he doesn't appear to, at this point, be jealous of David because obviously David was at one point in the past anointed, right, by God, that one day he will become king. At this point, Jonathan does not exhibit any kind of jealousy towards David. He's just literally trying to save his life, right? And, once again, this is almost intentional slowdown, but you can't accuse the author of intentionally slowing you down because he's introducing dialogue, which to this point, the dialogue has not been this lengthy. So therefore, the syntax is not something that is unexpected, right? The change in the structure is not unexpected if it's a completely different style of writing, right? It's a dialogue. Prior to that, you barely hear from David. He is notoriously very, very curt, very blunt also, and so is his poetry. He's extremely blunt, all right? And he's very short. But then here, especially in the next chapter, we're going to hear him talk, and he speaks a whole lot, right? And we're going to get a sense of his style, which, as I mentioned, is unique. Okay. Let's go on, right? So this was verses 1 through 7. I'm going to go through a few more here in chapter 19 of the first book of Samuel. And there was war again, and David went out and fought with the Philistines and slew them with a great slaughter, and they fled from him. And the evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul as he sat in his house with his javelin in his hand. And David played with his hand. And Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with a javelin, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence, and he smote the javelin into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Saul also sent messengers unto David's house to watch him and to slay him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, If thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain. So Michal led David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. And Michal took an image and laid it in the bed, and put a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster, and covered it with a cloth. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, He is sick. And Saul sent the messengers again to see David, saying, Bring him up to me in the bed, that I may slay him. And when the messengers were come in, behold, there was an image in the bed with a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster. And Saul said unto Michal, Why hast thou deceived me so, and sent away mine enemy, that he is escaped? And Michal answered Saul, He said unto me, Let me go, why should I kill thee? Once again, very difficult to read. There's so much happening in just whatever this is, 9 verses, right? Just one paragraph. There's so much going on, and the language is so difficult that it's a struggle, but this is a very critical part of the story. So at this point, once again, David goes out. David is extremely popular. He's extremely popular with, now again, if you remember, he was made captain of 1,000 after he was sent away from Saul and not in his presence, but he's still a captain of a massive force, right? And he's also, we were told in the previous chapters that he's extremely popular with everyone, with all of the commanders, with all of his servants, or that is his subordinates, right? Fellow warriors. He's also extremely popular with women. Who would have thought? They create a song and keep singing it about him, right? I mean, imagine how many men on earth have a song that women have created and sing about that man, right? And this is something we read about 3,000 years later. This person was not just incredibly popular, he was incredibly well known. Now, this is a tight-knit community, right? Even though they didn't have social media back then, they had festivities where they would gather the entire society, they would gather together to celebrate God at appointed times. And everyone knew physically, visually, who David was. People knew him. So he was, at that point, he was a living legend, right? And King Saul, once again, he's spiraling to such an extent that he just simply can't get over that fact. And he wants to kill him. So this is a concerted effort. Sending messengers doesn't mean like a messenger today. Hey, how are you? Right? This is just literally means that he's sending assassins, right? He's sending assassins to kill David as they lay in wait. Now, King Saul knows this is completely against the rules of conduct, right? These are rules of conduct. God has explicitly said that the person who lays in wait to kill someone else should be in turn killed, right? That is a huge no-no, right? And what is interesting is that these types of assassinations and assassination attempts, they escalate after this. They completely escalate, and we see David navigating very skillfully this issue with assassinations. However, he cannot prevent them. It's just above and beyond his control. So these types of events and incidents, they escalate in society to a great extent, even throughout the times of David, much less during Solomon, after he kind of puts the kibosh on all kinds of nonsense, and essentially the society lives in peace and prosperity for a long time. But during the time of David, these types of political intrigue, murder, assassination, they just simply escalate. And this is a rule of conduct that is not acceptable in that society by God, because that's what God told them. But we see King Saul start this trend, if you will, right? So he sends assassins. What his daughter does is she lets, right, Michal, the wife of David, she lets him down through the window and then puts an image, some sort of I don't know, who knows what she put there, but and then she put goat's hair as if it's him. The assassins come in a second time, and then they've discovered that they have been lied to. And then King Saul addresses Michal and said, "Why hast thou deceived me so, and sent away mine enemy that he's escaped?" And Michal answered, "So he said to me, let me go, why should I kill thee?" So Michal says that David threatened her with her life, when that's truly not the case, right? She told him, "Get away, because you're going to be dead." Why would David be running away from these messengers? I mean, this is David after all, right? He's the one that defeated Goliath. Why couldn't he handle those messengers? Let's just phrase it this way. First of all, King Saul is a Benjamite, so he's from the tribe of Benjamin, whereas David is from the tribe of Judah, right? The Benjamites were the most formidable warriors at that point. If you recall, last time I told you that 700 of them could sling within a hair's breadth, right? A stone, a rock. They were incredible soldiers. They overwhelmed, at one point in the previous civil wars, they overwhelmed all the other 11 tribes, 10 tribes combined, okay, twice with a much smaller force. So these are not your average savages running around trying to kill David here. These are extremely professional and competent people, right? These are essentially what you would now consider special forces, right? I mean, they're the best of the best, and they're coming after you. So it's not like, some 9'9" savage. Another thing that is extremely interesting here is how King Saul addresses his daughter, okay? When he finds out that she lied to him, or at least that she helped David escape. This is very different from the way that he treats his son. So Jonathan also, later on, as we'll find out, of course, this book is available to everyone, so there's no spoiler alerts over here. But as we'll find out later, Jonathan also lets David run away, right? Saul tries to kill Jonathan. He tries to kill his son with a javelin, very similar to this incident where David escapes another javelin thrown at him, and instead the javelin hits the wall, right? So Jonathan is, essentially his father is trying to kill him, and then Jonathan barely escapes, right? So his treatment of his daughter is very different from his treatment of his son. And once again, the patriarchy here gave her a break, I guess. Okay. So how does this chapter, how does it end, right? This strange, pivotal chapter. It ends with a very bizarre scene. Very bizarre scene. So, and I'm reading sequentially over here, and this is essentially the end of the chapter. This is the end of chapter 19. And here's how it goes. So David fled and escaped and came to Samuel to Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and dwelt in Naioth. And Saul sent messengers to take David. And when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing as appointed over them, the Spirit of God was upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. And it was told Saul, he sent other messengers, and they prophesied likewise. And Saul sent messengers again the third time, and they prophesied also. Then went he also to Ramah, and came to a great well that is in Shetchu, and he asked and said, Where are Samuel and David? And one said, Behold, they be at Naioth in Ramah. And he went thither to Naioth in Ramah, and the Spirit of God was upon him also. And he went on and prophesied until he came to Naioth in Ramah. And he stripped off his clothes also, and prophesied before Samuel in like manner, and laid down naked all that day and all that night. Wherefore they say, is Saul also among the prophets? Right? So what happens here is David flees, right? He escapes and he goes to Samuel, his old buddy, the one who anointed him as a youth, right? Long before this event. Samuel is your chill prophet. He's just hanging out at Ramah. So anyway, he tells him what happens. And they go in and live in Naioth, some town, right? Saul sends assassins 3 times, and this supernatural incident occurs 3 times before King Saul himself goes to Nayat in Ramah. And so what happens is the Spirit of God comes upon them and they start prophesying. So prophesying in the King James Version, in an old English, prophesying doesn't necessarily mean that you're telling prophecies about some event that's going to happen in the future. It could also simply mean preaching, right? However, the text here definitely does not indicate that these people were doing any preaching. What the text here implies, especially after Saul also starts prophesying and he lays down naked all that day and all that night, right? What this is telling us is that it was some sort of a supernatural event where they potentially are just acting like crazy, insane people, like fools, right? I mean, laying down naked all day and night, and probably some sort of chanting, right? I mean, they just simply lose their minds. That's not your typical prophesying like one of the prophets, right? But I'm not 100% sure. It's not exactly explicitly stated what exactly they were prophesying and doing, right? So this is a very bizarre end to chapter 19. And once again, I want to make clear that in the life of David, there's nothing that is truly that out of what we consider to be natural, right? This is a supernatural event, no doubt. There's another few instances where he has this device, and it has a specific name, but we do not know what that device is, other than we know that he asks God using that device, okay? But the answers that he gets are very yes, no, right? So for all we know, he could be just flipping a coin, right? We just don't know what that device is. That device after the exile to Babylon is not mentioned again, so it just doesn't exist. But it just is a device where he would ask God, should I pursue these people? Should I fight them or should I not, right? That kind of device, and he gets very short answers. Yes, no. So once again, the supernaturality of David is not limited to some extreme supernatural events like Moses parting the Red Sea, right? Or striking a rock and water coming out of it, burying the entire army of Pharaoh, right? David's supernaturality is the combination of all of these attributes that make him a person that is very close to what is mythological at this point, right? So people have a hard time believing that that person actually did exist, right? But once again, Jesus Christ talked a whole lot about David. David is the last name that he mentions in the last book, in the last chapter. The book is called Revelation, right? That he is both the root and the offspring of David. So, all right, next time what we're going to hear is we're going to hear some awesome dialogue by King David himself, future King David himself.